When Western countries imposed the sanctions on Russia, they sought to punish Moscow for its illegal invasion of Ukraine and cripple its economy. And that effort has failed in large part because of China's economic support. So why wasn't this outcome anticipated? And are there steps the countries could have taken to prevent this outcome?
Right. So I think let's give the sanctioning countries the benefit of the doubt first, right? So Russia was an economy that was deeply integrated with Western economies, particularly European economies, and was deeply integrated in terms of banking and other components of its financial system with a US dollar-dominated global financial system. So there was cause for optimism that sort of, significantly unplugging Russia from the Western economy could cause serious damage. But I think a few things happened from there. One, we underestimated the depth and resilience of both the Russian economy and the Chinese economy, and especially when the two combined, right? Both were pretty sizable economies and pretty complex industrial supply chains, as well as fairly developed military industrial complexes. Also, I think Western countries face and still face a number of economic and political constraints. One major constraint was that the US and some European countries were not willing to take Russian energy entirely out of the market for fear of supply and pricing disruption. When the Western countries are already facing surging inflation and associated political pressure, so they did not want an energy shock, they did not want a price shock. So subsequently, the U.S. Treasury designed this price cap scheme, which is clever, but it tries to achieve these conflicting goals of, one, maintain the Russia supply on the market, but two, reduce the Russian revenue from the supply. So these two contradictory goals are hard to maintain. Another political constraint was that, let's don't forget that some of the, our allies and friendly countries have continued to transact with Russia, right? India comes into my mind. Aside from China, India is a big Russian oil buyer, purchaser. But, we also, particularly US, count on India to be a significant counterweight to China in Asia. So we have not been willing to kind of sort of bring down the hammer on some of these countries. And finally, I want to make the point, it's all relative. So I do think, the sanctions have done damage on Russian economy and its capability to maintain its industrial production. But it's Russia against Ukraine. Ukraine never had much of a steady and robust revenue from energy import like Russia did. And Ukraine never did have such a robust military-industrial complex like Russia already has. So Ukraine almost depends on the West entirely for finance, as well as for weapon supply. And we all know that those supplies have been delayed and slowing down or even drying up recently.
See, you mentioned, Yan-Mei, that some of the sanctions have been successful. So maybe you can parse for us where they've been successful and where they've failed.
Right. So I think, for example, China so far, at least the Chinese state, has been careful not to cross the brightest of the Western red lines of supplying lethal weapons to Russia, right? So there are more grayer zones, but it has stayed behind that red line. Also, I think Russia, based on reports, has its import revenue from energy has been reduced. And recently, Gazprom has commissioned an external report, a research report, showing that it has been struggling in terms of replacing the Western Europe as a market and replacing the lost revenue from Europe. So I think the revenue constraint has taken a bite. Also, I think some of the banking sanctions has also taken effect. Chinese state-owned banks and other bigger banks that have international exposures have been very careful about their Russian transactions, and they abide by sanctions. They do their diligence about these sanctions just as diligently as Western companies. So I think on those fronts, the sanctions has had an effect. And also overall, Russia is not necessarily an exemplary, modern, prosperous economy, right? So, and it has very much turned its economy into a wartime mobilization economy.
So, if I'm correct, the invasion, of course, of Ukraine was February of 2022, but the surge in China's exports to Russia, according to the data, really shows that these exports began to surge almost a year later. So how can you explain that? Why didn't exports begin to increase after the invasion?
Right. So as we said, before the war, the Russian economy was very Western-facing. It was depended on Europe for export of energy, for revenue. It depended on Europe mostly for imported industrial goods. And to reorient that economy to be China-facing would take time. I think probably most of the slowing down would happen in the financial part. Right? So previously, a lot of the Russian banks were very plugged into the SWIFT system. They used either US dollar or euro for transaction. Most Russian companies were pricing their goods in USD or euro, and when in the corporate strategy, they have to do the currency hedging based on the pairing of Russian ruble with the euro or the USD. So reorient that and to find alternative transaction system and the banking system would take time. On the other hand, I think the Chinese companies took a cautionary approach to begin with as well. So anecdotally, at the onset of the sanctions, we're hearing a lot of Chinese banks just stopped doing Russian transactions entirely. They were, they wanted to take time to figure out where are the red lines they cannot cross, and how could they find alternative routes around, right? So that also took time. And I think on the industrial front, again, anecdotally, we hear that there was the Arctic LNG project that Chinese state-owned companies has been collaborating with Russian company, but the establishment of the project relied mainly on capital goods from European countries. And because of the sanctions, they had to replace the European machinery with Chinese machinery, and that took a few months as well. And in the meantime, the project was paused. So I think there were frictions, but it seems that after a few months, the Chinese and Russian companies and other entities were able to smooth things out.
As you noted, the Chinese major banks were overexposed to the U.S. dollar, obviously didn't want to be subject to sanctions. But there have been these regional banks that have been facilitating the financial transactions with Russia. Maybe you can explain a bit how this isn't the first time that China has used this playbook, because this is the way they have managed the circumventing of sanctions, UN sanctions on North Korea and Iran. So did China sort of learn lessons from those episodes and they're now using it now?
I think the most prominent example is the Bank of Kunlun, which is now regional specialized bank that focuses on transactions with Iran. And so Bank of Kunlun has a long history of facilitating the oil import from Iran with Chinese state-owned oil majors. And so it has been long on the U.S. blacklist. It has been sanctioned. The story is a little bit interesting because for a long time, I think the owner of Bank of Kunlun, which is CNPC, had ambition of developing Bank of Kunlun into an international bank to facilitate its own overseas expansion. But then, of course, that comes on the trade-off of Bank of Kunlun becoming more vulnerable to U.S. sanctions. I think for a period during the Trump administration, Bank of Kunlun actually paused transaction with Iran, I think in the hope of, one, being taken off the blacklist, and also perhaps I think during the Trump administration, there was threat of not just sanctioning Bank of Kunlun, but also other entities that transact with it, potentially Chinese state-owned enterprises. And that frightened the Bank of Kunlun from pausing to facilitating transactions with Iran. However, now that caution seems to be out of the window, they're backing the Iran trade business. And so this model can be replicated for banking with Russia. But however, I want to caution that just having a bank itself isolated from international exposure is not enough, right? So the U.S. in theory could keep drawing the circle wider and wider. So for example, if China finds another regional bank to do banking with Russian business, but whoever on the Chinese side continue banking with this regional sanctioned bank, then could be in theory blacklisted. So let's come back to the Bank of Kunlun example. I think what ultimately shielded the Iran oil transaction from U.S. sanctions was that Chinese state-owned oil majors, which have a lot of overseas assets and operations, backed out of the Iran trade. So mostly now it's this Chinese independent so-called teacup refineries that are now buying Iranian oil, right? So they are not concerned about being sanctioned because they have very little, if any, international exposure. So what I'm saying is, I think China and Russia will be able to develop a similar network, but again, it takes time. It's not a bank. It will be a network.
So we'll talk about energy in a minute because it's really important to dig into that in more detail. But apart from energy, what are the most crucial items that China has been supplying to Russia that Moscow wouldn't have been able to obtain elsewhere?
Right. So I think when it boils down to the sanctions were hoping to achieve two main projects. One was to deny revenues to Russia. Two was to deny industrial goods to Russia. But China was able to replace, at least a chunk of both, right? So we talked about the energy import. The other side of the equation was China, backed by its very comprehensive and capable industrial supply chain, as well as expensive capacity, has been able to replace a lot of the industrial goods that Russia no longer has access to from Western countries. And these include pretty, consumer appliances, consumer electronics, cars. Now I think 80% or even more cars sold in Russia are Chinese, mobile phones, but then arguably more problematic dual-use goods such as navigational equipment, some aircraft components. And then there are also semiconductors, which has two components, semiconductors supplied by Chinese companies, produced by Chinese companies, as well as semiconductors seems to have originating from Western countries that somehow has been transshipped via China to Russia.
So digging into the energy piece, as you wrote in your paper, Russia's now China's biggest supplier of crude oil, second largest supplier of coal, third largest for natural gas. Before this, I think Saudi Arabia was the biggest supplier of energy to China. And I always thought that China did want to limit its vulnerability of the energy that was being supplied through water, through maritime shipments, and import more over land from Russia. But at the same time, I also always thought that China didn't want to be over-dependent on any one supplier, even Russia, which has had good relations with China for some time. But of course, that relationship has tightened a lot since the invasion of Ukraine. But I wanted to understand what the incentive is for China to have gone like even further and really, I think, become more dependent on energy from Russia. And you make the argument that it isn't price. It isn't because it's cheap energy. So what is driving China in this decision to really capture the Russian energy market?
Right. As you said, I think energy supply reliability is the primary incentive for China when it comes to purchasing Russian energy, right? So because a lot of the Russian gas, a lot of the coal and some of the oil travel via land rather than sea. So when China imports this energy from the sea, it transits through some of the troubled waters in the Middle East, right? Like the choke point of the Red Sea, which now are has been destabilized. And also, we have for years been hearing from China about this concern of this Malacca dilemma, right? China has for years, going back to more than 10 years ago, concerned that most of its energy transit is in narrow strait in Southeast Asia, which could be vulnerable in the case of a conflict to being choked off either by the US or Indian Navy. So they have always, for years, been trying to develop alternative supply routes, and Russia comes handy. But as you said, even with that, China is wary of being over-dependent on one supplier. Russia has for years been pushing China to develop the so-called Powers of Siberia 2, which would allow Russia to open a pipeline from the oil field that previously supplied Eastern Europe and link it to China, right? But China, for years, more than 10 years, have said pretty much no to that project. That's because it would, with that new capacity, would push China's import of Russian natural gas to about 2/3 of overall import, and that's too much for Chinese policymakers, I think. And two, such a long, expensive pipeline would be very vulnerable to U.S. sanctions, especially with the Nord Stream project as the cautionary precedent. Right? So what I heard as rumor that Russia may entertain the idea of taking up all the cost and risk of building this line and connect it all the way to the Chinese border, and maybe Chinese leaders would then, that would tip their cost-benefit calculation and would get a yes from China. But that's just a speculation for now.
Have the industrial policies pursued by the United States and its allies facilitated this increased trade between China and Russia? And if so, how has that worked in what industries? And is that a major factor or just a minor factor?
I think overall, I don't see direct input from the Western industrial policy, the pushing up the sort of the U.S.-China trade. But I think arguably some of the export controls, as well as now we're seeing the rising trade barriers, are increasing kind of like the self-sufficiency drive in China. And so for China to expand its, industrial capability, and also to look for alternative markets, and Russia being one of them. And three, just kind of, increase Chinese skill of evading some of the controls, some of the choke points from the West.
Do you think that that the United States and the EU and other countries will impose more sanctions on China to try and really punish China or deter China from providing more of the goods that are going into Russia's defense industry, enabling Moscow to prosecute this war? When we were recently at a conference together, our Stockholm China Forum, just a couple of weeks ago, and it seemed to me that the Europeans were just very leery of imposing more sanctions on China. How do you see that?
I think to really, as you said, deter China, or really kind of reduce and thin the China-Russia economic ties, will come there will be some pain for the sanctioning countries. And I think that's probably at the origin of the European reluctance. Right? So I think China, that means more Chinese companies have to be added to the blacklist. And there has to be a lot more enforcement and tracking capability. Right now, I think pretty much the European Union relies a lot on the enforcement capability of the United States, which arguably has much longer and much capable of such, surveillance, intelligence gathering, tracking, enforcement capabilities than European countries. But then for Europe, need to develop the secondary sanction capability. One, willingness first to the second, the capability, and three, the stomach to face Chinese retaliation. And also, I think we have to understand that it will be a never-ending cat and mouse game. For example, some of the companies that have been channeling the banned chips and even weapons components and even weapons to Russia are Chinese individuals, small trading companies that pop up in, Hong Kong, Singapore, other Southeast Asian countries, South Asian countries, Central Asian countries, right? They also have a network of very long trading chains. And the US has sanctioned dozens of them. But because they're small and they're quite crafty, it doesn't take them much time and effort to build another shell to pop up somewhere else to continue these transactions. Right? So I think so for the U.S. to track these companies and try to I think for these companies deterrence doesn't work. They really need to be stopped and punished, and for the U.S. to do it alone is not enough.
On the issue of Chinese retaliation, can you talk a little bit about how China is using tools now to retaliate against the West? This is a relatively new phenomenon, but where do you think it's going? And when you look at this, like from the European perspective, what kind of retaliation are they really worried about? And how far do you think China would go in taking retaliatory measures?
Right. So let me broaden the picture out a little bit, right? When we talk about China's retaliations, oftentimes applied, it's kind of a hybrid warfare. China retaliates can be because it's, as you said, it's not happy that its own companies are sanctioned by the U.S. It's not happy because of some political reasons, like Lithuania, upgrade relations with Taiwan, or some other economic tit for tat. So China deploys a combination of, in this economic warfare, China deploys a combination of nominally WTO compliant tools, such as, anti-subsidy, anti-dumping investigations, and tariffs, and tools entirely outside the WTO. Sometimes the target country's exports just suddenly do not clear the Chinese customs anymore. In the case of Lithuania, the country just disappeared from the Chinese customs clearing system, and that the reason was not given. Also, there are sort of arm's length tactics like consumer boycotts. But then there's a new phenomenon, which is that China has now formally established its export control regime. Right? So that was established formally in the last couple of years. And those were mainly right now targeted as a few of these critical minerals. So as a result, for example, Sweden hasn't been able to import graphite from China for a couple of years. And then again, that's not explained why Sweden was denied graphite from China. A plausible explanation is that Sweden happens to have the most viable electric vehicle battery companies in Europe. And graphite is the key ingredient for the battery. Right? So China probably wants to slow down a competitor. And then so just let me wrap this up. I think, in terms of how China selects its targets, intuitively, of course, it wants to maximize pressure and cost on the opponent and then minimize inconvenience to itself. And from that, we can deduce that consumer goods oftentimes are more vulnerable than industrial goods. And often agricultural products are high on the target list because farmers tend to be quite influential in their home countries. And finally, cars are almost always, in the crosshair because China has the biggest car market in the world, and there are numerous foreign and domestic brands competing for market shares.
One of your conclusions, Yanmei, in your paper is that China's economic support for Russia is probably plateaued. So why is this? And will China's economic support for Russia really likely change in sort of the character of the kind of support it's giving? What are the variables that you think will affect it going forward?
So at the bottom line is China is not running a charity in terms of its economic relations with China, right? It wants to show, it still wants to make money, or the Chinese companies that are participating in trade with China want to make money. So I think the Russian market probably has been saturated with Chinese goods, right? There are only so many Chinese mobile phones and cars that Russians can buy. Also, probably the purchasing power of Russia is plateauing, right? So there's only so much Russian energy that China and India can buy and provide Russia the revenue to then come around and purchase Chinese manufactured goods. So I think these combined probably means that we're seeing a plateauing of the bilateral trade.